This demonstration is specifically designed to help you become familiar with the methods that I use. I'll also talk to you about why I use those methods. For those who've been using my methods for some time, do try it again, because it's amazing what you'll pick up on the way. There's going to be a lot of information that I'll be talking about, and it'll be a great refresher for you. And also too, it will help you get into the zone, ready for painting the studies that we're going to continue on working. Let's talk about my priming method and why that evolved, why I invented it. Well, I used to paint in oils, and I loved the glazing method, the way I could glaze beautiful colours one on top of the other, and that gave such wonderful jewel-like colours and glow. When I started painting in watercolour, I realised that that's really not possible with the traditional methods. So I had to devise a method that would allow that to happen. The reason it doesn't work particularly well with the usual traditional methods is that the paint is sitting on the surface. So you put a layer of paint on your surface. Even if you let it dry, that paint will still, the majority of that paint still will sit on the surface. So you come in with a subsequent layer, and of course re-wetting that area, particularly where the paint is on the surface, that means that that's just going to lift and mix with your subsequent colour. Not only are you contaminating each colour, but you're also chancing that you could create mud. So this is why I experimented and came across my priming method. So let me tell you how this works. The priming method is a 3-stage method. Stage 1 is just dropping in some clear water over the area that's going to be painted. That will give a shiny effect. If you turn your head on the side, you can see the shiny effect. I'll see if I can tilt it. So you can see that there's a reasonable amount of water on there. Not so much that it's flowing and is going to create a little bit of a dam at one end when I tilted it like that, but there's enough there that it's going to wet those inner layers of the paper. The paper is like a sponge, so it's allowing that clear water to sink into those inner layers. Once the sheen has gone from my upper layer, I know then is the time to bring in my second clear water wash. That's stage 2 of my priming method. We'll allow this to dry just a small amount until we have that matte surface on the top. That's when we know that the second layer is ready to be added. My paper is now matte, but I know that it's wet underneath because if you turn your head on the side, it's very slightly different colour from a dried area. Now, the next layer that you bring in, you can choose how wet you want it. One of the things to remember is the more water you have on your paper or on your brush, the less control you're going to have. So the less water, the more control you're going to have. So think about whether you want the paint, when you come in with the third layer, whether you want the paint to just skate across the area, say if you're creating a sky or a wonderful watery background, then you would make your second wash quite wet, almost as wet as the first wash. But if you want to have more control over where it goes and you don't want it to skate off everywhere, then you just use less water. If you want to use less water than is already on your brush, just temper how much water is on your brush by just touching it on your rag, and then come in and drop the second clear water wash onto your already just very slightly damp paper. If you've put too much water on, take excess off onto your rag, but also use that water as a little bit of a reservoir and spread it around. If you're in a very dry situation where it's warm and there's not much humidity around, then you'll find that your paper, your paint, your water will be absorbed that much more quickly. But if you're in quite a humid place or humid season, then you'll find that it will take longer. And it's amazing the difference. Here in the studio lights, it dries really quite quickly. If you've put too much water on, use your brush like a sponge. Take some of the water off. Go back in and lift that. Just till you have the right amount that you're ready to work on. Now I do have a shiny surface, but not as much as I had before because I want to have a little bit more control. I've just laid in my second clear water wash. I haven't used as much water as I used with the first clear water wash because I want more control over how far the pigment is going to float. Remember, more water, less control. Less water, more control. So I've put less water on this time because I don't want it to just disperse all the way over the area that I'm going to be painting. I want to control how fast it goes and where it goes. So I'm just dropping in fact, I think I've got a little bit too much liquid on my brush. I'm just going to drop in my colour. And you see how we've got soft edges and the colour is just gently fingering its way across the painting. I'm just dabbing my colour. I talked previously about dabbing as opposed to stroking. If I stroke, you see what happens. We get quite a blush of colour at the end of the stroke, whereas and a lighter area at the start. Whereas if we dab, we get that blush all the way through, and you get a more saturated amount of pigment. Once again, it gives you more control to be able to dab. And the wonderful thing about getting the clear water washes to go right into the paper, what that is actually doing is it's allowing the area inside the paper to be moist. So when we come along with our pigmented wash, our pigment is also being drawn down into those inner layers, because the pigment is so finely ground and it's transparent, so there is nothing left sitting on the surface. So that gets pulled down, and when this area becomes dry, you'll find that it's almost impossible to shift it with subsequent washes. So that's set into the paper, and that allows us to then come in and create lovely glowing washes on the top, and we're not risking the chance of it lifting and mixing and creating mud with the subsequent layers. So there are lots of great benefits to the priming method. One of the other great benefits is that by allowing the inner layers of the paper to become quite moist, when we come along with our pigment on top, we have much more time before that's absorbed. What happens is that it sits on the surface for longer because the inner layers are already damp. So what that does, it buys us a lot more time. We can keep coming in with different colours, or we can manoeuvre our paint and do all sorts of things before the watercolour has got to that no-go stage. You know, the one where you know that you can't work anymore on it, otherwise you're going to disturb the beautiful wash that you've just created. These days I use the priming method usually for my yellow underwash and maybe one or two washes after that. It just depends on the subject. I'll also use it for large areas. Smaller areas, I'll just use the wet and wet. So let's work on the wet and wet now. This is a traditional watercolour method. Wet on wet is just laying wet paint into a wet surface. There's no priming here, there's just one layer of clear water and then coming straight in with our pigmented wash. It's important to lay the water in relatively evenly. Try not to have any of those little holidays. And it's a good idea to put your head down on the side when you've finished putting your clear water on, and you can quite clearly see then where those little holidays are. Even the amount of water that you have on your paper with your brush, allow it to act like a sponge if you feel you've got too much water there. Once again, remember, it's that same old rule: more water, less control; less water, more control. So I'm picking up my pigment now and I'm dropping this in. Now you'll notice that once again I'm still dabbing, and you'll also notice that I go from side to side. Another important thing is that it's important to break the surface when you're dabbing. If I don't break the surface, do you see what happens? I'm not depositing very much pigment. It's just like stroking. So break that surface and you'll be dropping in your colour. It doesn't hurt to actually stroke a little bit around the edge to make sure that you get a relatively smooth edge, and then come back in and do your dabbing. You can keep on adding water and pigment as long as your pigment is flowing quite well. Soon as that underneath layer of water has become a little bit dry, you're then almost working wet on dry. And what that does naturally, if you can understand that first priming method, that I explained the reason for that, it just follows on with the wet on wet. If we don't have enough water on our paper, the pigment is going to sit on the surface. And of course that will cause trouble with subsequent washes. Going from side to side is actually a safeguard, because if you started working around and then gradually coming in, you might find that you run out of wet paper, and it's easier to add it. If you're working across like this, you're going to get a much more even effect. I need a little bit more water on my brush because I can feel that it's not flowing quite as well as I'd like. You have to be very careful not to put in too much water. If I came in with too much water, the water would flow into the lovely wash that we've just created. And I'm sure you've all heard of cauliflowers or blooms. That's what can happen. That's how it's created. An area that's more dry is suddenly infiltrated by a much more wet wash, and that often causes a bit of a backwash over onto the dry area, and then you get those unusual marks. And some people really like to have those, so there's nothing wrong with it. It just comes down to what you would like to see yourself. So I'm just going to let that dry. The next one is another traditional method, and that's wet on dry. Once again, it's really important that you go from side to side because you're going into dry paper. You can see how this pigment isn't flowing forward at all, and if I let that dry like that, we'd have a very harsh edge form right where the wetness and the pigment meet the dry paper. So I've got 3 relatively even washes. I can see my wet on dry is a little bit too wet, and it has pooled around the edge. What you can do if that happens, as long as you don't disturb the area that's drying the most, you can pick up a little bit of that extra out of there. Use your brush a little bit like a sponge. One of the dangers with using too much water in your wash is that it can push the pigment to the side. What's actually happening, even though our paper is stretched, there's a lot of water in here, and the paper is stretched so there's an even tension on the whole sheet, but because that area where we've just put the water, it does raise slightly, and this area here has raised up, so the pigment and the water has just ran around the edge a little bit. It's so interesting when you think about why things happen, because there are times when you'd really want that to happen, and there'll probably be instances where you'll find that would be really beneficial. So always remember the things that happen with watercolour. A lot of them are accidents, but they're happy accidents. The second to last method I'm going to show you is another traditional method, and it's called dry brush. And dry brush has got next to no water, just a very small amount, just to make the paint a little bit more soluble. And it's just really a matter of doing lines, creating lines. And you see, this is rather interesting. The paint stays exactly where I put it. There's no water to allow it to flow. I used dry brush on my last wash by fine-tuning of the painting at the end, and quite often I'll soften lines, but it just gives that extra punch. But naturally you can't put water over top of this because, as you know now, it will lift that paint. So dry brush is used for right near the end. The very last method that I use, I call polishing. And it's something that I've developed that I've found has actually helped me a great deal with my fine-tuning methods right at the very end, because once again we're not using very much water at all. When it works extremely well is when you've created your fine-tuning and your dry brush right at the very end, and you know that you can't come in with another clear water wash because you know that that's going to lift it. But you may decide, imagine if you're painting a face, you may decide that you would like to have a little bit more blush to the cheek, but you don't want to disturb the dry brush that you've created. So just with a very small amount of pigment on my brush, I'll come in and I'll just gently brush in just a little bit of rouge for that cheek. And for this I always use my little scrubby brush. It's a Da Vinci Series 122 because it can take all this scrubbing and this pushing on the hairs. It's got a lovely amount of flex to that brush. It's really rather beautiful. And you just soften it out so you just get a little hint of it at the edge. But you can see it's nowhere near as even as when we use water. I can see that we have a little area here which is starting to develop into a little bit of a bloom. I'm just going to pick up a little bit of clear water on my brush, take the excess off on my rag and just try and even that out. This happened when I moved the board just a wee while ago. Disturbing the pigment on the top can easily cause something like that, and you disturb the pigment by moving the board. So here we have priming, wet and wet, wet on dry, dry brush and polishing. And these are the 5 methods that I use. Now you'll notice that the first 3, the paint is evenly dispersed throughout them. And that's the goal, that's what you want to achieve. If you find that yours are maybe a little bit scratchy or a little bit blotchy, it's always because of the amount of water that you have. Just adjust that and become familiar with that amount of water, and then you'll find that you can create almost any painting with these 5 techniques. If you find that your first attempt is not as good as you'd like, or you'd like a little bit more practice, try them again, become familiar with it, gain that expertise, and you'll be ready to fly. Have fun.